Bonjour, good afternoon. I'm happy to introduce Klinjor Helgason, Professor of Art History of the University of Iceland and former Chairman of the Association of Nordic Art Historians for Iceland. He works as an artist and theorist. His most recent interests have been the investigation of the 20th century art history and its geography regarding its correlation to contemporary art and culture. In its publication, Beyond Within, Post-Cinematic Possibilities of Play and Action, he examines art, cinema and philosophy with regard to their sociological components and explores the extent to which they can be understood as a call to personal contemplation and reflection. It is an attempt to understand cinema and video art as a space of social and cultural resistance and provides a corresponding theoretical treatment. His work reveals spaces of dynamic tensions, articulates modes of the libidinal economy in relation to resistance, as well as political and aesthetic serenity. In addition, the ontological basis for artistic interventions plays a fundamental role in his works. Alongside the theoretical references to Lyotard, Deleuze or Whitehead, his artistic influence can be traced back to Vito Acconci, Yoko Ono and Chris Marker. In his last article, Viðtökur á verkum Þórarins Þórðarsonar listmálara, he represents an art historical and critical review of the reception of the specific work by Þórarin Þórðarson, an Icelandic artist working in the first quarter of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. What I'll be speaking about today is a sort of a broad review of 20th century Scandinavian art and how it's been, and especially how the work from the first part of the 20th century has been revisited in the last 3 decades. And I'll be analyzing that sort of revisitation and the complexities and contradictions involved in those. I'll try to speak slowly as well, since I imagine many of my audience are French speaking. So I'll start with a short extract from an interview with Icelandic artist Ragnar Kjartansson in 2013. I'm trying to speak those like I'm speaking English, but anyway, and here it goes.
There's something so sad about Scandinavia. It's like this ideal part of the world, but it is just so black. It's just so fucking sad. It's Satanavia, you know. And that's why I'm a big fan of it. I'm a big fan of the blues, and then I'm a big fan of the Scandinavian pain.
So that's sort of the upstart of what I'm going to be talking about, which is how young Scandinavian artists react to what I would say the historical situation today, and also what you see there is the luxury for us Icelanders to be both within and without Scandinavia. Often we are forgotten, so we can pretend to be onlookers from outside when we are invited to be included. So to go from there, a little bit of theory. So my first position, and the one that I would sort of tend to oppose through this conversation, will be the position that Robert Rosenblum made in 1977, the American art historian, where he posed the position that you could extend the German Romanticism as an art historical concept all the way through the ages until the abstract expressionism. So the way this idea presented in his book in 1977 is that in a way you're talking about an ahistorical tendency in art, that you really can't, he's flattening out the historical element, changing it into a forever type element, a romanticism that can be extended, and so in a way he's erasing general ideas about modern art and the controversies involved. That's my position on that. But also it's a very important position when you try to look at how art has been described in the latter part of the 20th century, because it's a very important position that needs to be kept in mind. So in the middle of that, you could say that trend is the fin du siècle scandinave, or the turn of the 19th century Scandinavian, where it hardly matters in Rosenblum's account, but we get a bit of Munch. But that's sort of this Rosenblum, he attracted attention to northern German aka Scandinavian art, as we've heard earlier today. But this led to, we could say, a counter-response. The first counter-response would be by Kirk Varnedoe, who in 1992 had an exhibition called Northern Light or something of the sort. Most of these exhibitions about northern late 19th century and early 20th century were about light, so not about what I'm going to talk about today. So as you can see here, then Varnedoe, he sort of proposes a more historical assumption based on Marxist art history, in that you can't actually call the Nordic art ahistorical in any way, that it has to be treated as part of the sort of the post-impressionist symbolism, and as such as part of modernism or the modern art trend. That is not, you can't reduce it back to an historical epoch 50 years earlier than it was made. It's not old-fashioned in that sense. But also what he points to is what I would say is it's a colonialization within the modern, and I hope there are no Norwegians here because they hate those ideas. As a colonialization in the modern, in the sense that Scandinavian art is put into a colonial structure vis-a-vis the central art scene, which would have been Paris at the time. Whereas to be accepted in Paris, Scandinavian artists had to become national artists. They had to take on national traits because that was what was expected in France at the time. So to be able to make themselves visible in France, they couldn't be too French, they had to be Nordic. And we know that sort of from, there's an artist, Icelandic artist, that was active in the 30s in France and Copenhagen, and in Copenhagen he was described as being French, and therefore he sold his work there. In France he was described as being Nordic, and that's why they included him in all the French exhibitions in Japan at the time. So we have that sort of tendency going on, and that is the tendency, the main thesis of Varnedoe, in a way, that fin du siècle art is a modern variation, but forced into a special national look via colonial influences. So if we look into it, how this actually sort of goes on into today, into contemporary art, we could say that we have the idea that Scandinavian art is an alternative trend of history, sort of a libertarian alternative history, another history, but going the same way as the mainstream canonical history, that it is an alternative modernity. And but with a you could say almost a post-colonial, two long words in English are bad for me, identity. So the national identity of Scandinavia is affected by these post-colonial influences, even at the moment when Scandinavia is integrated into a much larger international art field. No, that's the wrong way. So going from that, the other position, which we see at the same time in the 80s and 90s and up to now, is to look at as Scandinavian art as a romantic nationalism or national romanticism, which is sort of which makes it in a sense anachronical, not modern as the Vernedeau thesis places it, but out of time, 50 years too late, in a sense. So these are the two issues, and what we actually get, and which I find interesting. I rather agree with Vernedeau than the Rosenblum idea, but that's not the point here. The point is that both have had effect on the discourse in the last 30 years. So what we get is, you could say, postmodern dialectic happening there, where these two positions intermingle. You have, in these exhibitions affected by Vernedeau, you have authors that are entirely describing the artwork they're describing as romantic nationalism or national romanticism, which is probably the better term. So you have these issues intermingling, and what you could say also is that you have a slippage between the two. They are not placed as controversies, and you don't get a synthesis really. You get a constant slippage between the two positions. So, in one say, you could say that the modernist thesis is clear, as a clear one, or is of light, while the nationalistic or national separatist idea is sort of a position of obscurity. And I think this is the final. So, and that's one part of that is, would you say that when that affects contemporary artists as Kjartansson, or contemporary literature or contemporary TV, then you get something that you could call the Nordic noir, a special Nordic identity or post-colonial identity that sells when you try to, that French, German and British cinema companies can use in Scandinavia when they are producing Scandinavian TV shows, for instance, or selling novels by Arnaldur Indriðason or some other, or Wallander. He was not actually the author, but. So, that was theory. Now to images. And I want to start by the first Scandinavian painter of import, in a way, I could say that, or a Northern German painter, or a Danish-Norwegian painter, depending on the point of view, or the first Norwegian painter. But of course, Johan Christian Dahl was a painter who was a poor guy from Bergen who traveled to Dresden and became a famous painter there. And the painting I'm starting with is not a painting from Scandinavia, but a painting, one of his seminal paintings he made in his early career in southern Italy. So this is Vesuvius, an eruption there. And this sort of shows he goes, in a way you could say, if we take this as a post-colonial situation, it was much easier to travel to Italy from Dresden than to travel to Norway from Dresden. So he goes to Dresden, and there he finds images that, in a way, are nostalgic of how he wants to put himself apart from the other romantics. Okay, so you can see there we have the dusk or the twilight, or what we want to call it, which is characteristic of many of these dark Scandinavian paintings. And also we have an eruption, which sort of is a marker of the opening of hell in Iceland, for instance, but of course more apt in Vesuvius. To go further on, if you go on to Prince Eugen and the forest, where we have sort of the atmospheric or not atmospheric paintings of the late 19th century in Scandinavia, where we have sort of an exact example of these of either a specialized, isolating Scandinavian identity, which is romanticizing these trees, or on the other hand, we have an effect of post-impressionism in a way of making the field of view flatter in this sense, but that's not exactly the way, with a slight sort of dark glow in the middle. This is the medieval forest. This is the Grimm's Tales forest. So this is adapting this ideology of the dark north in a way of making a national paint, or a national painting in this sense, but I would propose it was a more Scandinavian painting style. Another by Prince Eugen, where you have this sort of natural landscape with a very heavy sky and the darkness that's emanating from the pond in the middle. So you have these sort of stylistic attributes. And I want to point out that I'm choosing the dark pictures now. This is not the entirety of Scandinavian art at the time. There's a lot of paintings in the midnight sun with the light. But I'm taking this trend of darkness, and elaborating upon that. And to the background picture as well, which is by Þórarinn B. Þorláksson. You can practice that later. So he is the first Icelandic painter trained in Denmark in the late 19th century, and he is a painter who has been described either as one that closely follows the landscape he's painting, and as a 19th century romantic painter using a style from the early 19th century. So that's one of his descriptions, choosing Þingvellir, which is the sort of the site of the former Icelandic parliament and a very direct national location. This painting has also been described as incorporating the colors of the Icelandic flag, white, blue, and supposedly you can find a slight reddish tinge on one of the clouds. Hannes Sigurðsson, an Icelandic art critic, he described this work as being a totally nationalistic work, and as being a work that where you could see the colors of the Icelandic flag. And Þórarinn B. Þorláksson actually became later in his career an official painter of the government, and he was an important man in the committee that designed the Icelandic flag. Unfortunately, that was 12 years after this painting was made, so that color connection would not have been in his mind at the time. The first original plans for the Icelandic flags were blue with a white cross on it. The red cross was added later in the field. So, and also this is I would say, a very strong over deduction of the work. Other commentators have commented on the way he simplifies the image, the way he makes the grass, even the clouds and the mountains into simpler forms than they usually are at this early stage. So they point out that he is a very clear Nordic symbolic painter. So we have these two positions in his reading. Other paintings by Nordic artists at the time, like those of Munch or of Emil Nolde, of course, Emil Nolde being a prominent expressionist. And so it's very difficult to talk about him as doing work that is romantic in that sense. But of course, the expanse of Nordic symbolism, if you use that word at the time, goes from expressionism into paintings that are more naturalistic, but still portray the feeling for the subject. And as we heard earlier today, this subject is something that you know very well, even if you're not living in the city. So it's a feeling, an attention to try to define a feeling for the subject, and the subject is the landscape of your homeland, you could say, or Heimat in German even. Gustav Fjellstad is another one. Fjellstad is another one who creates these sort of chiaroscuro composition where you have the opposition of the light and the dark, the snowy scape, and then you have the immense darkness of the lake in between, sort of that draws you into the picture if you see it by itself. Another paint, so to go into cityscapes. You have Eugene Jansson, who in 1904 paints these really strange paintings of lagoons or from this in the city or in the city. So these really sketchy, you could say, expressionist demonstrations of the darkness, of the dark, but of the, you could say it's one characteristic of this is the summer darkness in a way, the way the light behaves when you have light but nobody's there. These lonely scenes in the Nordic where you can actually, there is like in Göteborg or Stockholm, where in the middle of the night you have light, but it's still the middle of the night, even though you don't have midnight sunlight there. And then you have other painters that are more, you could say, baroque in the way they look, but are and used to be termed as romantic in their terms, like Willem Hammershøi, who is the most famous probably of this newly rediscovered generation, the Danish painter. So here we have a very intimate candle scene, similarly lit as a traditional Baroque painting, but we don't have Jesus there and the people around the candles. It's just the candles and the space they light. So the way the candles work is in their chiaroscuro effect, they accentuate the oscuro, unlike the Baroque paintings who were accentuating the chiaro. So we have that sort of, the paintings just are a necessary contrast to enhance the blackness. Or this painting, which I really love by him, where you have the artist's easels in there, and what you can say, you have a very common living room set in a very bourgeois surroundings, and you have a painting above it, but the location of the artist's work is in obscurity. It is. We don't have the painter behind it, as in some other famous Baroque paintings. The easel is alone, and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, empty square in that sense. Over to France. Of course, Per Krogh is the most famous Norwegian painter of the early 20th century. Sorry, but he was brought up in Paris, and in 1912 that's sort of the time when he's moving from Paris to Copenhagen and Oslo, and trying to make a career for himself. It's only 40 years later that he makes the huge mural for the United Nations Security Council. So he's the painter that did that. But at the time, he's trying to tackle with his image in living in Paris, sort of trying to make a living, not as a painter, because we know from documented that actually in Copenhagen in 1912, he taught an Icelandic actress tango, which was a huge novelty in 1912 in Paris. So he was the one that brought tango to Copenhagen and Oslo, and eventually through this actress to Reykjavik. So we can see him as a huge dandy at the time, moving to Oslo slowly to become a great Norwegian painter. But this is sort of his tackling in his youth. You can see you have this figure, this faceless figure, embroidered in darkness, and with a small sort of flock of brightness in the background. So, and remember, tango at the time didn't have any text, so it was before these totally sad tango texts we had later. So he's sort of looking forward into some bright future, but his presence is somewhat dark at the time. So over to Finland. So part of this is Sibelius's saddest symphony, and the one that he got the worst critique for at the time when it was premiered. But it's a symphony number 4 when he was, which is supposedly written when he was not drinking, which was a bad time for him. But I'll play you the beginning of that. So. Okay, so, and the ending is just as black, or even blacker, I think so. But you have to check that out for yourself. So this is sort of part of that same attribute that we're seeing in the Nordic. I mean, it's an area that is defining itself partially through this darkness and partially through the light at the same time. This is one of the early successful Swedish film, The Outlaw and His Wife in English, and Le Proscrit, I found out it was called in French, so anyway, by Swedish director Victor Sjöström, after a play by Jóhann Sigurjónsson, an Icelandic author. So this is the first Icelandic film by proxy. And this is a film that sort of has a very dramatic story about a thief who marries a wealthy woman and moves with, but he's accused of being a thief, so they escape out into the wild center of Iceland, which in the film is northern Sweden, and where they enjoy a very enjoyable summer swimming in the lakes, but then bad things happen, and in the cold and darkness of winter they succumb to insanity, you could say. So this is sort of the first strong cinematic example of this darkness. It's very dark. Okay, we'll just go to the next one. We're running out of time anyway. So, turning from that to Carl Theodor Dreyer to this really, well, all of his films are really interesting and weird, but this is the Vampire that he made in 1932, where he went to great lengths at creating a very dark atmosphere. He even flash lit all the film stock before filming, so it had a little bit of light on it before filming to decrease the contrast so he could get a darker gray feeling for the entire film. And I hope this works. I mean, did it work before? Okay, this is working.
De luz. Más.
So you can see this is the protagonist in his coffin being brought by the French vampire to his death. So it's sort of a really eerie film all through. So, and you never really know what's happening totally, but it has a really beautiful visual characteristic to it, and that sort of constant darkness. Are we doing on time? Okay, I think we're in good time. Back to the two paintings. So back to Þórarinn Björn, who is the Icelandic painter who painted the 1899 painting before. This is a spectacular self-portrait of him from 1915. This is from after he was an official painter, you could say, in Iceland from 1908 to 1914, painting important figures like Jón Sigurðsson, his official portrait, who is the independence hero of Iceland in a way. So he was painting the Danish king visiting Iceland, etc., etc. But after 2014, he stopped being an official painter and became personal again. This sort of is one part of his sort of dark images. I mean, he's, 45 there? He's not very old, so, but he looks like he's really constrained, estranged. In a way, it always feels to me like one of Munch's later self-portraits, but done in a Baroque style, so it just makes it a bit weird. It's expressionistic, but still with this sort of Baroque-like painterly effect to it. Another Icelandic painter working later on, when we follow her later on, is Juliana Sveinsdottir, who did this self-portrait of her in 1931 when she was a painter who studied in Denmark, tried to move back in Iceland in 1927, moved back to Denmark after 2 years because it was totally impossible for a woman artist not married to somebody rich to make a living in Iceland. So she moved back and became a very successful painter in Denmark. But this is sort of one of her self-portraits she made shortly after she returned to Denmark in a way. Sort of drawing her back totally into the shade and almost letting the dark colors modulate her being in a way. On a different sense, we could also go to Samuel Johansen Mykines and his visions, which are in the same Nordic darkness. So he's one of the first prominent Faroese painters, but he sort of goes in a nouveau realist, you could say, style into that, paints himself into that dark image, and working with the Faroese ideas, history, the seascape, and here there are people that are on a boat actually that are returning from a funeral. So we have that aspect. Or the later works, and we have had a special sort of seminar here on Helen Scherfbeck, the Swedish artist. So this is one. No, she's Finnish, right? She's Finnish. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So so her sort of self-portraits towards the end of her career are really dark and self-effacing in a way. Some of them are, so which is quite interesting in this aspect. Or another woman painter from Sweden, Vera Nilsson, who's so you could say middle expressionist landscape, sort of presaging the expressionist movement a few decades later. Her landscape, despite all the foliage and whatever, they always seem like they're occurring after a nuclear war or something. They always seem desolate in a sense. So you have a really clear personal vision of and a dark vision there, with a pink sky above as well. Or to continue with that, now with Juliana Sveinsdottir, whose self-portrait we saw before. This is one of her paintings she made in the Westman Islands, south of Iceland, after she returned there after having been away for more than a decade. So she couldn't return during the war, and she returned there. And there you have these, after making still lifes and nature paintings in Fyn in Denmark. She returned to Iceland too and worked at an immense pace to make a series of dark landscape painting the rain, painting the storms in the Westman Islands, painting a desolation in that area, which usually is sunny and bright with puffins, believe me or not. So you can see that in the first part of the century, this is sort of how this aspect of Nordic noir, you could say, evolves through painting, this strain. And so now we're probably run out of time, but we started punctually, so hopefully we can go a little bit longer. So going to the contemporary, going to Nordic cinema in the 80s and 90s, we can see a resurgence of that idea in a way in Nordic cinema. And this is Lars von Trier's first feature film, An Element of Crime, he made in 1984. And it's raining all the time. It's set in some sort of idyllic, some sort of hellish German named landscape. And you never know what's happening, but it's all bad. So, a short version from close to the end of the film.
It's a gun. No wonder the Osmonds. He couldn't quite cope with the element of crime. He loved systems, did Osmond. When Harry Gray died, Osmond brought his system to completion. Took him over. You believed his act.
Lovely pan there, I think. Though there's nothing lovely. It's all in this dark, nightish, orangey black, the film is. So now you've seen part of the ending, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't connect to anything anyway. And of course, since we're talking about 80s and 90s cinema, we have to go to Finland for another example. I mean, this is I'm attempting to translate the direct Finnish title there because it's more apt than the Hans Andersen title in French usually. But but still he bases this film on the much girl in English. What's it called in English again? Well, people understand the French anyway. So it's based on the Hans Christian Andersen. Very loosely based on the Hans Christian Andersen story. So this is about a girl who is mistreated in all possible dimensions. Nobody wants to dance with her at a tango dance, but then she's mistreated by various people and her family, and she ends up by killing them all. And we'll just go into the atmosphere of the end. Tango and Sibelius.
Kuinka saatoitkaan tehdä kaikki unelmat ihanat tyhjiksi haaveiksi vain. Nyt nähdä sain tylyn kylmän maan. Hento kukka rakkauden kuihtuja halla jo uskoni vei. Kaikkensa antaa ja pettyä saa. On muistoja kantaa, vain vaikeampaa. Nyt loista ei, hukka rakkauden. Sinun kylmä katseesi jäätävä hymysi sammutti sen. Kaikkensa antaa ja pettyä saa.
Okay. So you get the feeling she didn't get away with the crime, so you can be satisfied. But then to bring us closer to the future as well, so these sorts of films, I think they fed into the renewal of the Nordic dark, and even maybe these sort of ideas procured in the ideas about romanticism, though I wouldn't be sure about that. But these were usually really well-educated filmmakers. But I think that attitude we see also in Nordic crime at the moment. And this is, well, I had to use this scene from Wallander because it's called Darkness, so it seemed quite perfect. So this is sort of one scene, and if I'm not...
Bara ögonblicket innan som kan kännas lite obehagligt. Våga. Man måste våga. Släpp henne!
Okay. Or the scene from Trapped, where we have the snow trapping people in a very dark environment totally during the winter in Iceland. And a huge amount of crimes happening. I mean, one murder every 2 years, I think, in Iceland on average. But like in old Nordic noir films and miniseries, then there are usually more crimes committed in one series than in all the Nordic countries in 10 years. So.
Þetta verði allt í lagi. Þetta var ekki mér að kenna. Þarna hljóp djöfullinn í mig.
And her name is Cole Brown, so it's also very dark as well. So, but so this is sort of you can see how these attitudes and to bring it this this talk to a halt, I want to go back to the fine art scene in a way, and to the contemporary. First, to a few works by Green and Drax that sort of describe in a way that sort of isolation, the feeling of isolation and strangeness that Ragnar also describes in his Satania. So you can see that in this sort of high-rise building built in various museums around the world by Elmgren and Draxet. I saw this work actually in the National Gallery in Copenhagen, where it was really great. So this sort of out-of-world Nordic apartment block that people could peer into, look into people's lives, or their Prada in Marfa in Texas. This sort of idea of isolation of the Nordic being apart from everything else, despite, as the Prada signifies, being totally having a lot of wealth in a way. Well, and of course you will have seen the last work by Elmgren and Draxet, if you happen to be there the month that this booth was the only part of the Paris Art Fair. So they raised their own booth as an isolated island within the Grand Palais a month before all of the other booths were raised. So I think this is the best work actually, and very Scandinavian, drawing on that sort of loneliness within the darkness, the lonely farm we see in various pictures. And to finish on the bright side of life, which is the end of the video. So this is the Scandinavian Pain exhibition at Moderna Museet in Malmö, a work Ragnar has shown in various places. So he fills that space with a lot of dark monk work, etc., dark Nordic paintings. And this is his performance there, where he performs his final tune to what he finds the very tragic Nordic song.
The winner takes it all. The winner takes it all. The winner takes it all. The winner takes it all.
So some of you would have preferred Agneta, but so thank you very much for listening. We maybe can grab 2 minutes or so. Okay. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much. It was absolutely fascinating. You started with talking about romanticism, well, national romanticism. I don't know if it's important in your structure of ideas, but is it about romanticism? The dark Nordic?
I think some of the ideas in the Dark North stem from romantic ideas in a way, and I think we have to keep historical periods in their time. So I would say romanticism, it's not a useful concept after 1850. Then we have to talk about realism or naturalism or the different modes of the modern, but that they feed from romantic ideas, definitely, I think. So it's not about romanticism, but about being a vampire on romantic ideas.
For example, in the Dutch painting, in the Dutch landscape painting, there's also some kind of the Dutch light that is often referred to. And if you're speaking about the Nordic darkness, I want to know, is there maybe also something like the typical Nordic light?
Yes, there is. I mean, if you go back to the period from around the 1900s, then we have these wonderful scenes of naked girls jumping into ponds, etc., etc. And there's really a lot of Nordic lights, but quite often the Nordic light gets tainted with darkness. So you never have that. I mean, it rarely is allowed to be alone in a way. I could have chosen paintings of Nordic light, but they always would have some sort of that sorrowful ambiguity that, like Kjartansson is referring to, I would say. Infused by romantic ideals. So thank you very much for being here. I'm glad to have such a lot of people attending. So thank you.